Going to take you live now to a news conference with Labor's energy spokesperson Mark Butler, who's speaking right here at Parliament House.
Businesses have made the same commitment, and increasingly Scott Morrison is out of touch with the general community. Research this morning confirms that 3/4 of Australians support a net zero emissions commitment by 2050, including more than 2/3 of self-identified Liberal voters, because Australian businesses, the Australian community understand that you can't be committed to tackling climate change, to implementing the Paris Agreement, without being committed to net zero emissions by 2050. The Prime Minister should be honest about that, instead of relying on tired 10-year-old scare campaigns. Happy to take questions.
Your party obviously is committed to 2050. What about 2030? What's your target then, and will you be announcing a target?
Well, we thought it was important to state these core pillars of climate policy early on in the parliamentary term. We're only a quarter of the way through this parliamentary term. We've reaffirmed our commitment to the Paris Agreement, no Kyoto carryover credits, the net zero emissions by 2050, and we've also reaffirmed our commitment to the transition to clean energy, with no taxpayer financing going to prop up new coal-fired power stations that investors won't touch with a barge pole. Now our job is to sit down with businesses, with workers, with farmers, with local councils, chambers of commerce and the like, and start to work through the detail of our climate policy so that it's ready before Australian voters, before Australian businesses, well before the election in 2 years' time.
Obviously, you've got to go through some of the detail, but would you anticipate your target would be at least more ambitious than the Coalition's 26 to 28% by 2030?
Well, I've been very clear. The Coalition's target, which was plucked out of the air by Tony Abbott a number of years ago, is simply inconsistent with the Paris Agreement. All of the scientists, all of the experts who've looked at that target say that it's consistent with 3 degrees or more of global warming, which would be catastrophic for a vulnerable continent like Australia and for the rest of the world. That's why we've consistently opposed Tony Abbott and now Scott Morrison's target for 2030. But we want to sit down with businesses and communities and workers and farmers and talk about all these details. That's what they would expect. They don't expect us to come up with a policy in isolation. They want to be listened to. They want to be engaged about what they think the future should look like for Australia, and that's becoming increasingly clear. They recognise a net zero emissions future for Australia is the responsible thing for our generation to do, and something which, as the CSIRO says, will be good for the economy.
So if you're talking about consistency with the 2-degree warming target in Paris, the Climate Change Authority in 2015 warned that Australia would have to reduce its emissions between 40 and 65% in 2005 levels to be consistent with that. Are you open to that sort of target?
Well, we took to the last 2 elections a target based on Climate Change Authority advice in that report that you talk about. It was released in 2014 from memory. It's now 6 years old. It will be 8 years old by the time of the next election, and it envisaged a 15-year time frame. We've been very consistent that our approach to this question, whether it's the long-term target around net zero emissions or medium-term targets, will be based on scientific advice. The government's current target, we still don't know where that came from. Tony Abbott plucked it out of the air. He's never produced scientific evidence or modelling to show it's consistent with what we need to do on climate change. That will be our approach, though, to take scientific advice, to work with the community, to work with businesses on a proper pathway to net zero emissions by 2050.